South Africa's education system has suffered a series of damaging setbacks over the past few months. Among them, a World Economic Forum study which ranked South Africa's math and science graduates second worst in the world, the nationwide teacher strikes which demanded the resignation of Education Minister Angie Motshekga and her deputy, as well as the ongoing textbook delivery scandal. Joining us now to debate this is Professor Jonathan Jansen. He's the Vice Chancellor at the University of the Free State. A very good evening to you, Professor Jansen. Of course, very many challenges. Now, South Africans celebrated 19 years of the breakthrough to democracy yesterday. And of course, many of us looking at the fact that the education system simply not developing the kinds of skills that we require for your economy. Where do you think we are falling down, and are we in fact failing the next generation?
Thank you, Karima. The school system in South Africa works very well for 20% of our children. And so it is true that in the schools, particularly suburban schools, where you have a deracialized middle class, attending those schools, the schools work fairly well. And then, of course, as we know, even in very dire circumstances, you get individual schools that do well. The problem is it doesn't work for 80% of our children. Mm-hmm. And that is, you cannot build a country, you cannot build an economy, and you cannot build a democracy when the majority of the children are in fact left out of the system. Mm-hmm. And so since 1994, every single international test of achievement, all of our national assessments of education performance show the same thing over and over again. And then we had, of course, the horrific reports from the Eastern Cape, a week ago, with this eminent group, persons group, showing again that the pit latrines and the mud schools and the lack of materials is still very much there. Mm-hmm. And so it is unsurprising that in fact we are always rated near the bottom in every test of international comparison. And so no, we are not preparing the next generation, and we're not preparing the country for all its inherent potential, for all its promise. We are failing our children.
Now, of course, when you put these challenges to the authorities, the immediate answer is that we spend a substantial amount of the national budget on education, in fact, quite a large slice. Of course, we know that the majority of that slice goes towards teacher salaries. So certainly in terms of resources, that's not necessarily the problem. But of course, the key question is, are we getting value for money? And many will say the short answer is no. Why do you think it is that we're not getting value for money? Because certainly in terms of, the slice of the budget pie, education is getting quite a large slice of that pie.
That is correct. Both as a percentage of GDP and, as you said, as a slice of the national budget, education in this country is much more expensive in terms of how much we spend than in any other country in SADC, including Botswana. Now that should worry us, because when you compare, and I've worked a lot in countries like Mozambique, looking at their school system, Namibia and Zimbabwe, and when you look at those schools, they're not fancy, they don't have all the resources, and so on, but they deliver much better results, and the question is why. And so from an economics of education perspective, it's very clear we are unable to turn those resources into results. And that is why I agree with the former Minister of Finance that the primary problem is not money. The problem is, how do we make that money work in the interest of children? So what lies behind this? There's been study after study that has shown that at a very basic level, South African schools do not spend the same amount of instructional time, that is teacher in front of the classroom, as a country like Botswana does, for example, and so on. So if the teachers don't even show up, then how on earth are you going to get the kind of value for money that you're speaking about? And that is what really troubles me. It's not a fancy curriculum. It's not a new assessment model. Those kinds of things, new ministers tend to do for political reasons. What we lack is attention to some very basic things.
Teachers in class on time.
From bad schools
like I said,
It's
teachers
just
in
showing up on
school,
time.
yeah, and teaching properly.
Yeah,
now,
and
we've had several compacts between government and teachers where they all commit, to these very basic things that you say we require, that proves the difference between why countries like Botswana is doing much better than us. Why are we not able to realize the commitment that people often put on paper? Why can't it happen in action? What is missing?
It's very simple. We don't have political will. You see, in order to make the compact work, whatever the compact might have been with the trade unions, for example, the teacher unions, you have to have a government that is sufficiently engaged and concerned about this to sort of say, nobody is going to interrupt the schooling of a poor child in Bizana, for example, okay, because that has consequences for domestic, economies, for the chances of those individual children, and for the country as a whole. But the problem is we don't have that political. I have not yet seen, from the president down, somebody that says, beyond the speech, beyond the state of the nation, this is what we're going to do to make sure that there isn't an interruption of the children's, the education of the children of the poor. Now, what really pains me as a citizen is that if you go and look at the schools where we, as middle classes, the unionists have their children, those schools are not interrupted.
Professor
But
Jansen,
we have the audacity to interrupt those who can least afford an interruption to schooling, and so on. And I'm talking about this week. Take the Eastern Cape, for example. There's a whole lot of schools that I called today that we cannot visit simply because there is this so-called go slow. Yesterday or 2 days ago in one of the Cape Town papers, it showed the MEC for Education sitting on top of the gate of a school because he was locked out. Unless you stop this madness and government takes control of its authority, rightful authority over schools to make sure they work for our children, we will have this discussion into the future.